She was 23 and quietly desperate, with no living parents, no dowry, and no place to sleep past the end of the week. All she carried was a small mother-of-pearl button in a folded square of linen, 3 pounds 4 shillings sewn into the hem of her cloak, and a written character from a housekeeper who had died the winter before. And with that little, Rebecca Shaw took the post no one else would take, nurse and companion to the Duke of Wexbury's forgotten aunt, in a shuttered country house in Ashcombe that the family had not opened in 11 years. But what nobody told her, and what the Duke himself had spent a decade hoping the old woman would forget, was that in a locked writing box beneath the aunt's bed lay a document that could unmake him. Settle in, and if you like stories told slowly, subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. Rebecca Shaw had been born in the market town of Halstead in the spring of 1847, the only surviving child of a linen draper named Thomas Shaw and his wife Anne, who had come down from the north as a young woman with strong hands and a plain, level way of speaking that Rebecca inherited whole. The shop had never been prosperous, but it had been steady, bolts of gray cotton and Irish linen stacked to the ceiling, a brass bell over the door, the smell of new cloth and pipe tobacco, and the coal stove her father kept burning even in April. And for the first 14 years of her life, Rebecca had believed in the untroubled way of children, that the shop and the rooms above it and the small yard behind would go on being hers forever. Her mother died of a fever in the winter of 1861, and her father, who had loved his wife more openly than he had ever been able to love his daughter, seemed to fold in on himself afterwards like a paper lantern. He kept the shop open, and he kept Rebecca fed, but he did not speak much, and he began to drink a little in the evenings, and then a little more, and by the time Rebecca was 17, the accounts were in a state, and the bolts on the shelves were older than the customers who came in to finger them without buying. He died in the summer of 1866, owing £412 to a wholesaler in Colchester and £68 to the landlord, and the sale of the stock and fittings covered a little more than half of it, and the rest was written off with the sort of resigned pity that felt, to Rebecca, more humiliating than anger would have been. She was 19 when she walked out of the shop for the last time, with a small trunk and the mother-of-pearl button that had come off her mother's wedding jacket the week before she died, and which Anne had pressed into her palm without saying anything, and which Rebecca had kept ever since folded in a square of linen inside a tin box that had once held tea. She went into service because there was nothing else to go into, and she was fortunate, more fortunate than she then understood, to be taken on as a housemaid at Fenwick Hall in Suffolk under a housekeeper named Mrs. Marjorie Hollis, a widow of 62 with iron-gray hair and a limp from a fall on ice in her 30s, who had run the Fenwick household for 31 years and knew the price of every candle, every sheet, every joint of mutton that passed through her stores. Mrs. Hollis did not smile often and did not scold often either. She watched, and she noted, and after 3 weeks she moved Rebecca from the scullery to the linen room, and after 3 months she began teaching her the things that a good housekeeper needed to know: how to keep a still room book, how to make a poultice of linseed and mustard, how to turn a mattress and air a room that had been shut, how to speak to a physician without either cringing or bristling, how to sit with a woman in her last illness and neither weep nor pretend. Rebecca stayed at Fenwick Hall for 4 years, and in that time, Mrs. Hollis taught her the herbal remedies she herself had learned from her own mother in Norfolk: chamomile for the nerves, willow bark for fever, elder for the chest, a syrup of horehound for a cough that would not settle, and she taught her the harder skills too, the ones that had no name and could not be written in a book: how to see, in a house, which rooms were being kept and which were being neglected, and what that neglect meant, and who in the household knew about it, and who did not. Mrs. Hollis died in her sleep in February of 1870, and Rebecca, who had loved her without ever quite telling her so, laid her out herself and combed her hair and put a sprig of dried lavender inside the folded hands, and afterwards she wrote out a character for herself in the careful copper plate Mrs. Hollis had drilled into her, and she signed it in Mrs. Hollis's name, because there was no one else to sign it, and because she knew, with a clarity that did not feel like dishonesty, that Mrs. Hollis would have signed it exactly so. The new housekeeper at Fenwick Hall was a younger woman brought down from London who did not care for the old staff, and by Michaelmas, Rebecca was politely told that her services would not be required past the quarter, and she packed her trunk again, and she took the character out of the tin box where she kept the mother-of-pearl button, and she began, in the plain, unshowy way she did most things, to look for another place. It was in the third week of that looking, sitting in the parlor of a registry office in Bury St. Edmunds with a cold cup of tea in her hand, that she saw the notice pinned to the board. Nurse companion wanted, elderly lady, country house in Ashcombe, references required, discretion essential, and something in the word discretion made her look at it twice. She copied the address into the small notebook she kept in her pocket, and she called at the London solicitor's chambers, named at the foot of the notice 2 days later, in a black bonnet retrimmed with new ribbon, and the character folded twice inside a clean envelope, and the interview was conducted not by a solicitor, but by a thin clerk of about 40 named Mr. Peter Redgrave, who read the character through once without expression, and then read it through again more slowly, and asked her 3 questions. He asked whether she had ever nursed a woman of advanced years through a long illness, and she said she had twice. He asked whether she was accustomed to a quiet household, and she said she was. He asked whether she had family in Suffolk or elsewhere who would expect regular visits, and she said she had none living, and at that answer his face changed very slightly, in a way she would only understand later, and he said the position paid £22 a year with board and firing and a half-day on the 4th Sunday of the month, and that the lady in question was the aunt of a gentleman of some standing who preferred that his aunt's situation not be discussed in the village or in any correspondence, and Rebecca understood the shape of what was being said, and she said she understood, and Mr. Redgrave wrote out a note of engagement on a half-sheet of blue paper, and blotted it, and handed it across the desk. She was to travel to Ashcombe within the week. She was to present herself at the house, which was called Wexbury Grange, and she was to send no word ahead. A trap would not be sent for her from the village, because a trap being sent for her would be noticed. She would walk from the coaching inn at Little Merton, which was 3 miles distant by the lane, and she would ask no one for directions. Mr. Redgrave did not shake her hand when she left. He wished her a safe journey in the voice of a man closing an account. She walked back to her lodgings in the rain, and she folded the note of engagement inside the tin box with the button and the character, and she paid the landlady the 7 and 6pence she owed for the fortnight, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and she counted the money she had left. £3, 4 shillings, and 11 pence. She took the 4 shillings and 11 pence out and put it in her purse for the coach and the coffee and the bread of the journey, and the £3 she unpicked the hem of her grey wool cloak and slid inside, 1 sovereign at a time, and she sewed the hem back, with the small even stitches Mrs. Hollis had taught her when she was 19. She was not frightened. She had been frightened at 19 when the shop closed, and she had been frightened again the winter Mrs. Hollis died. And she had learned in between those 2 frights that being frightened did not alter the road in front of a person, and so she had put frightenedness down somewhere along the way, and had not picked it up again. She lay awake that night listening to the rain, and thinking not of the aunt or the house, but of the word discretion, and of the London clerk's face when she said she had no family living, and she understood that she had been chosen for exactly what she lacked, and she understood, too, that whatever she was walking into was a thing other women with people to write to had already refused. The coach from Bury Street. Edmunds left at 6:30 on the Tuesday morning in a grey, wet dawn, and Rebecca sat inside with her trunk lashed above, and her cloak drawn close, and beside her a farmer's wife with a basket of eggs, and across from her a young curate reading a book, and the coach rattled westward through the flat, wet fields of the county, and into the low hills beyond, past hedgerows, heavy with the last blackberries, and past coppices of hazel, and past small stone churches sitting square in their yards of yew. And the rain came and went, and the light stayed thin and grey, and Rebecca ate the bread and cheese she had brought at the second change of horses in a yard smelling of straw and coal smoke. And she asked the ostler how far it was to Little Merton, and he told her another 4 hours if the road held, and it did not entirely hold. and they were slowed on a hill by a cart of turnips overturned in the mud, and again by a flock of sheep being driven down to the market at a village whose name she did not catch. It was past 4 in the afternoon when the coach set her down at the yard of the Bluebell in Little Merton, and the light was already beginning to go, and she paid a boy 2pence to carry her trunk as far as the milestone at the edge of the village, and then she took it from him and thanked him, and she walked the rest of the way alone. The lane out of Little Merton toward Ashcombe was a chalk lane sunk between hedges the height of a man, and the hedges were dripping and the ruts were full of standing water, and she carried the trunk first on her right shoulder and then, after a mile, on her left, and she stopped twice to rest, once at a stile and once beside a shallow ford where a plank had been laid across for foot passengers. She saw no one on the road. She saw a heron rise out of a ditch and go slowly away over a field of stubble. She saw a farm gate hanging from one hinge, and beyond it a barn with half its slates gone. She saw the church tower of Ashcombe gray against the grayer sky about a mile before she reached the village, and she saw the village itself when she came around the last bend, 20 or 30 cottages of local stone with slate roofs blackened by weather, a small green with a pump, a low inn with a hanging sign she could not read in the failing light, and a lane leading off to the west between 2 stone gateposts topped with lichen and with the iron gates themselves standing open at an angle that suggested they had not been closed in a long time. She turned in at the gateposts because she had been told to. The drive was long and choked at the edges with nettles and hogweed grown tall and now beaten down by the rain, and the gravel underfoot had thinned to bare earth in places, and she walked along it in the last of the light with her trunk on her shoulder and her cloak wet through at the shoulders and her boots heavy with clay, and after perhaps a quarter of a mile the drive turned, and she saw Wexbury Grange for the first time. A long, low gray house of 2 stories with a slate roof and tall chimneys and windows shuttered along the whole of the west wing, and a single lamp burning in a room at the east end and no smoke coming from any chimney but one. She stood a moment at the edge of the gravel sweep to look at it, because she thought she might not have another chance to see the whole of it at once. The house was built of the same gray local stone as the cottages in the village, but coursed larger and older, with quoins at the corners darkened by 2 centuries of weather and lichens crusting the sills. The roof was slate, and along the western pitch she could count from where she stood at least a dozen slates missing or slipped, and one whole run of ridge tiles gone, showing a black line of tar felt exposed beneath. The chimneys were tall and set in pairs, 6 pairs in all, and only the easternmost showed a thin, wavering thread of coal smoke going up into the wet air. The windows of the west wing were shuttered from the outside with paneled shutters that had once been painted white and were now the color of old bone, and one shutter on the upper floor hung by its lower hinge and moved slightly in the wind. The east wing had leaded casements, and the lamp she had seen from the drive was burning in a downstairs room at that end, behind a curtain drawn most of the way across. She went up to the door because there was nothing else to do. The door was oak, iron-studded, with a knocker in the shape of a hare, and the knocker had gone green with verdigris. She lifted it and let it fall twice. She heard the sound go into the house and travel a long way before it stopped. After a while she heard slow footsteps and a bolt drawn, and the door opened a hand's breadth. The woman who opened it was perhaps 60, in a black stuff dress with a white apron gone gray at the hem, and she had a face that had been narrow to begin with and had grown narrower on short rations. She looked at Rebecca, at the trunk, at the note of engagement Rebecca held out, and stepped back to let her in without a word. Her name, she said in the hall, was Mrs. Ellen Barrow, and she was the only servant now kept in the house, and she cooked and cleaned and carried up what was needed to Miss Ida upstairs, and she had done so for 11 years. The hall was flagged in stone worn smooth in a track down its middle, and the walls were paneled to shoulder height in oak that had darkened almost to black. Above the paneling the plaster was stained in long yellow-brown watermarks running down from the cornice, and in 2 places the plaster had come away in patches the size of a dinner plate to show the lath beneath. A staircase went up at the back of the hall in 3 flights around a well, and the carpet on the stairs was worn through to the canvas in the center of each tread. A long case clock stood at the foot of the stairs with its pendulum still, and its face showing 20 minutes past 9 at some hour long past. Mrs. Barrow took Rebecca first to the kitchen, which was in the east wing and warm, with a range burning low and a kettle set on the hob, and gave her a cup of tea and a piece of bread and dripping, and while Rebecca ate, spoke in short sentences about the arrangement of the house. The west wing, she said, was shut, and had been shut. The main rooms downstairs, the drawing room, the dining room, the library, were kept closed, and the furniture in them was under Holland covers. Miss Ida had her bedroom above the kitchen, and next to it a sitting room, and those 2 rooms and the kitchen and the servants' passage were the only rooms in use. There was no gardener now. There was no coachman. The post came to the village and was fetched twice a week by a boy from the inn who left it at the back door. The doctor came from Little Merton when sent for, and had not been sent for since the spring. Rebecca was taken upstairs by candlelight to see Miss Ida. The stair rail was mahogany worn silky at the corners, and the runner smelt of dust and mice. At the top of the flight, Mrs. Barrow turned to the right along a corridor lit by a single sconce, and stopped at a door and knocked twice softly and went in. The room within was warmer than Rebecca had expected, with a small coal fire in a black grate and 2 candles burning on the mantel and a lamp on a table by the bed. The bed was a 4-post of dark wood with the curtains looped back, and in it, propped up on a great many pillows, sat a small woman of perhaps 78 in a white nightcap tied under the chin, with hands laid flat on the coverlet and eyes that were still very blue and looked at Rebecca directly. That was Miss Ida Wexbury, and she was, Rebecca understood without needing to be told, the person she had been sent for. Miss Ida looked at her for a long moment, then said in a voice thinner than her face suggested, "You will do. Sit down. Mrs. Barrow will fetch your things." Rebecca sat on the low chair by the bed. The room, she saw now, was crowded quietly with the furniture of a long life. A writing desk of walnut against the far wall with its flap closed and locked, a chest of drawers in mahogany with brass handles, a small round table by the window with a workbox on it, a set of shelves holding perhaps 60 books in worn cloth and calf, and beneath the bed, when Rebecca's eye went there because she could not help it, the corner of a rosewood box just visible between the bed frame and the valance, banded in brass, with a small brass lock set into its lid. Rebecca had been at Wexbury Grange 9 days before she looked at the rosewood box properly, and she looked at it then only because Miss Ida asked her to. In the 9 days between, Rebecca had learned the rhythm of the house. She rose at 5:30 and lit the fire in Miss Ida's room and brought up hot water in a copper can and washed Miss Ida's face and hands with a flannel warmed at the fender and combed and plaited the long, thin white hair. She brought up breakfast on a tray, thin porridge, weak tea, a triangle of toast, and sat while Miss Ida ate what little she could eat. She read aloud in the mornings from whichever book Miss Ida asked for, which was usually a volume of sermons or a bound illustrated London news from 1859. She dressed the small ulcer on Miss Ida's left ankle every second day with a compress of linseed as Mrs. Hollis had taught her, and Miss Ida watched her hands while she did it and once said, "Whoever taught you knew her business." Rebecca said, "Mrs. Hollis at Fenwick." Miss Ida nodded once and did not ask further. On the 9th day, it rained all afternoon, and the light in the room went early, and Miss Ida asked her to draw the curtains and light the lamp, and then said, "Reach under the bed, child, and bring out the box." Rebecca knelt down on the carpet and put her arm beneath the valance and drew out the rosewood box. It was heavier than she had expected. It was about 14 inches long and 9 wide and 6 deep, banded in brass at the corners, with a small oval brass plate on the lid engraved I.W. 1832 in thin script, and a lock in the center of the lid. Miss Ida took a key from a ribbon around her neck and gave it to Rebecca and told her to open it. Inside the box, laid neatly and without dust because someone had kept it clean, were several things arranged in an order that had clearly not been disturbed in years. On the top, folded in tissue, was a lock of dark hair tied with a black ribbon. Beneath that, a bundle of letters in a woman's hand tied with faded blue tape. Beneath the letters, a small red leather case that when opened held a miniature on ivory of a young man in an army coat of the 1820s. Beneath the case, a chamois-wrapped shape that when Rebecca unwrapped it at Miss Ida's nod, proved to be a pair of gold guineas and 11 sovereigns and a small purse containing another 23 sovereigns in newer coin, 97 pounds in gold altogether, which was more money than Rebecca had ever held at once. And at the bottom of the box, laid flat under a sheet of thick plain paper, was a document folded in 3 of heavy legal parchment, sealed with red wax in 2 places and endorsed in a clerk's hand along the outer fold. Indenture of settlement, made this 3rd day of April, 1841, between the Right Honourable Charles Edward Wexbury, 5th Duke of Wexbury of the one part, and Ida Margaret Wexbury, spinster of the other part. Rebecca understood, before she had read a word of what was written within, that this was the paper the London clerk had meant when he had said discretion. She held it and did not open it, and looked at Miss Ida. Miss Ida said, "Read it aloud." Rebecca unfolded the parchment on the coverlet and read, in a voice she kept as steady as she could, the clauses within. That upon the death of the 4th Duke in the winter of 1840, his sister Ida Margaret Wexbury had been left, absolutely and in her own right, a moiety, the half of the manor of Wexbury and its lands, being some 1100 acres of arable and pasture, with the messuages and cottages thereon, together with the advowson of the parish church of Ashcombe. That the said moiety was hers, in fee simple, and could be devised by her by will to any person she chose, and that the said Charles Edward, her nephew, then a young man of 22, held the other moiety only and no more, and that the 2 moieties had never been legally united. Rebecca laid the parchment down on the coverlet. Miss Ida watched her face and said nothing for a while. Then Miss Ida said quite plainly, "He has told everyone I am simple. I am not. I have kept this here 11 years because I could not send it and be sure it would arrive. Now you have come, and you will carry it when I tell you, to a man in Ipswich whose address is inside the 2nd envelope in the bundle of letters. Not yet. Soon." She closed her hand briefly on Rebecca's wrist, and her hand was very cold and very light. And Rebecca felt, for the first time since Halstead, that she had been asked to do a thing that mattered. The carrying of the paper did not happen at once. Miss Ida wanted a week to write her own letter to accompany the deed, and Rebecca wanted the weather to lift enough that a woman walking to Little Merton with a heavy pocket would not be remarked. In that week, Rebecca did 3 things in a quiet order. She wrote out, in the copperplate Mrs. Hollis had taught her, a plain inventory of the box's contents on a half-sheet of paper, and Miss Ida signed it with a hand that shook but was legible, and Mrs. Ellen Barrow, called up for the purpose, signed as witness beneath, having been told only that it was a list of Miss Ida's private property, and no more. Rebecca folded that inventory into her tin box beside the mother-of-pearl button and the character. Then she copied the address from the 2nd envelope, which was written in a firm, masculine hand and read, Mr. Josiah Merrifield, Solicitor, 14 Silent Street, Ipswich, and she copied it into the small notebook she kept in her pocket, and she burned nothing and left nothing loose. Last, she asked Mrs. Barrow, in the kitchen over a pot of tea, whether there was a woman in the village who could sit an afternoon with Miss Ida if Rebecca were called away on an errand, and Mrs. Barrow, after a long look, named Mrs. Sarah Poole, the sexton's widow, aged 54, who had nursed her own mother through a 2-year illness, and would come for a shilling and her tea. Rebecca went that Thursday to the cottage beside the churchyard, and engaged Mrs. Poole for the following Tuesday, saying only that she must go into Ipswich on the mistress's business, and Mrs. Poole, who had lived in Ashcombe all her life and had seen more than she said, agreed and asked no questions. On the Tuesday morning, Rebecca walked to Little Merton in a cold, clear light, with the deed sewn flat between 2 pieces of oilcloth inside the bodice of her dress and Miss Ida's letter, and the inventory inside her reticule, and she took the 8 o'clock coach eastward to Ipswich. Mr. Josiah Merrifield was a man of about 55 in a black coat, with gray side whiskers and steel spectacles, and he read the deed once through without moving, and then a second time with a pencil in his hand, making small marks on a sheet of blotting paper. He asked Rebecca 3 questions and no more: whether Miss Ida was of sound mind, whether Miss Ida had signed anything since 1841 that might affect the settlement, and whether anyone in the Duke's household knew that Rebecca had come. Rebecca answered yes, no so far as she knew, and no. Mr. Merrifield laid the deed flat between 2 sheets of clean paper, tied it with tape, and locked it in his safe, and gave Rebecca a receipt in his own hand, endorsed Deed of Settlement of April 3, 1841, received of Miss Ida Margaret Wexbury by the hand of Miss Rebecca Shaw. He said he would prepare a caveat to be lodged at the land registry and a letter to the Duke's own solicitors informing them in careful language that his client's interest was known, documented, and now professionally represented, and he said this would take him 10 days. He charged Miss Ida 4 guineas as a first fee, which Rebecca paid from the chamois bundle, and he said quite gently that Miss Rebecca Shaw had done a considerable thing and should tell no one until he wrote. Rebecca folded the receipt into the tin box with the button and the character and the inventory, and took the afternoon coach home, and reached the Grange in the dusk with her boots wet and her bodice light, and her whole life altered. The 10 days passed. Rebecca did not speak of the Ipswich journey, and Miss Ida did not ask. She only nodded once when Rebecca said the paper was where it should be, and closed her eyes for a long time as though setting a weight down. On the 11th day, the boy from the inn brought a letter to the back door addressed to Miss Rebecca Shaw at Wexbury Grange, sealed with a lawyer's plain wax, and Rebecca opened it in the kitchen with Mrs. Barrow watching. Mr. Merrifield wrote that the caveat was lodged, that the Duke's solicitors in London had been served, and that the Duke himself had already written to Mr. Merrifield in what Mr. Merrifield described, in a single dry line, as terms neither temperate nor useful. He advised Miss Ida to remain at the Grange, to receive no visitor unaccompanied, to keep the household exactly as it was, and to send for the doctor from Little Merton to make a formal note in his own hand of Miss Ida's competence, which note would be worth its weight in gold in any court. Rebecca sent the boy back to the inn with a note for Dr. Andrew Fenn, the physician at Little Merton, a widower of 48, who had known Miss Ida in her middle years, and Dr. Fenn came the next morning in a gig, examined Miss Ida for half an hour with the door open and Mrs. Barrow present, and wrote on the spot, at Miss Ida's own writing desk, a certificate in 3 careful paragraphs, stating that Ida Margaret Wexbury, aged 78, was of clear mind and settled memory, and fit in all respects to conduct her own affairs. He signed and dated it. He would take no fee. He said, standing at the door with his hat in his hand, that he had wondered for years, and was glad to have been asked at last. Rebecca copied the certificate into her notebook and sent the original to Mr. Merrifield by the next post, wrapped in oilcloth inside a stout envelope, and paid the 4 pence from her own purse because she did not wish to touch Miss Ida's coin for so small a thing. After the certificate, other things began to move quietly in the manner of that country. Word of Dr. Fenn's visit reached the village within a day, and the village, which had assumed for 11 years that the old lady at the Grange was mazed and kept for her own good, adjusted itself without fuss. Mrs. Poole came on the following Tuesday and again the Tuesday after and became a settled fixture and would not take more than her shilling. The sexton, Mr. Robert Poole, aged 57, came one Saturday with his son and a ladder and a bundle of second-hand slates he had been keeping in his shed against a need, and between them, in an afternoon, they replaced the worst of the missing slates on the west pitch and stopped the run where the ridge tiles had gone with a strip of lead flashing bent to shape, and Rebecca paid him 7 shillings and a pot of Mrs. Barrow's damson jam, and he said the pot was worth the 7 shillings on its own. A carter named Mr. William Ashe, aged 40, brought a load of dry coal up the drive on a Wednesday, without being asked, saying only that he had heard Miss Ida was keeping better and would be wanting her fires, and would take his money when it suited. A widow from the far end of the village, Mrs. Hannah Redwood, aged 62, who had been dairymaid at the Grange in the 60s, walked up one morning with a basket containing 2 pounds of butter, a small round cheese, and a folded paper on which was written, in a laboring hand, a list of the names of the tenants on the Wexbury moiety as she remembered them, with the fields they held and the rents they had paid in 1859. And she said she thought Miss Rebecca Shaw might have use of it, and Rebecca, who had learned from Mrs. Hollis exactly what such a list was worth, thanked her without exclaiming, and gave her tea in the kitchen, and put the paper into the tin box that night beside the button, and the character, and the inventory, and the receipt, and thought that the tin box was becoming, without any plan of hers, an archive. Within a month of Mr. Merrifield's first letter, the shape of the house had altered without any wing being opened, or any furniture uncovered. The drive was still choked at the edges with nettles, and the west shutters still hung as they had hung, but the east chimney smoked morning and evening now instead of only evening, and a second chimney over the kitchen smoked at midday because Mrs. Barrow was baking twice a week again, as she had not baked in 11 years. The lane from the village to the Grange, which for 11 years had been walked only by the postboy, was now walked by Mrs. Poole on Tuesdays, by Dr. Fenn once a fortnight in his gig, by Mr. Ashe with coal or with a sack of flour, by Mrs. Redwood on a Friday morning with butter, and by the vicar, Mr. Henry Marsden, aged 61, who called on a Thursday afternoon and sat with Miss Ida for an hour, and read a psalm and drank a cup of tea, and, on his way out, said quietly to Rebecca in the hall that he had baptized Miss Ida in the year of the great frost, and that he had not been allowed inside the house since 1863, and that he hoped Miss Rebecca Shaw would send for him whenever Miss Ida wished it, and he shook Rebecca's hand, which no man in Ashcombe had yet done. The village knew Rebecca's name. In the shop on the green, the woman who kept it, Mrs. Alice Threadgold, aged 45, called her Miss Shaw, and set aside for her a pound of the better tea and a screw of Miss Ida's particular snuff without needing to be asked. At the inn, when Rebecca went in on a Sunday afternoon to arrange a trap into Little Merton, the landlord's wife brought her a glass of small beer she had not ordered and would not let her pay for it. A small ritual formed around the Tuesday visits of Mrs. Poole. Rebecca would leave a covered tray on the kitchen table with a piece of cold pie and an apple and a cup laid ready, and Mrs. Poole would eat before she went upstairs, and would leave her cup washed on the dresser, and neither woman had ever spoken the arrangement aloud. Another ritual formed around the reading. Miss Ida, who for years had been read sermons because they were what was to hand, now asked for other things: a volume of Cowper, an old-bound Blackwoods from 1847, and, one afternoon, the letters of the young man in the army coat, which Rebecca read aloud from the bundle in the rosewood box in a voice as level as she could make it, and Miss Ida listened with her eyes shut and her hand quiet on the coverlet, and afterward said only, "Thank you, my dear, that is enough for today." And Rebecca understood that a thing 48 years shut had been let out into the room, and might be let out again, but only by asking. The house was not restored. The west wing remained shut, and the plaster in the hall still bore its long yellow-brown watermarks, and the stair carpet was still worn through to the canvas. But the Grange was no longer a place where an old woman was being kept out of sight. It was a house where an old woman lived, and where a young woman worked, and where the village came and went at the back door, and where the post came 4 times a week now instead of 2, and where letters went out under Miss Rebecca Shaw's hand on Miss Ida Margaret Wexbury's business, and where the Duke, in his London house 80 miles away, was, for the first time in a decade, obliged to answer. On a still afternoon in the second week of November, Rebecca sat in the low chair by Miss Ida's bed with the tin box open on her lap. She had brought it up because Miss Ida had asked to see the mother of pearl button, having heard, in one of the long quiet hours of reading, that Rebecca carried it. Rebecca lifted the folded square of linen out and opened it on the coverlet, and Miss Ida touched the button once with the tip of her finger and said it was a good button, well made, and that Anne Shaw had chosen well. Beside the button on the coverlet lay the other things the tin box now held: the character signed in Mrs. Hollis's name, the inventory, Mr. Merrifield's receipt, Mrs. Redwood's folded paper with the tenant list of 1859, and a copy of Dr. Fenn's certificate in Rebecca's own copper plate. two women's hands had put those papers there, across 40 years and 2 counties, and neither woman had ever met the other. Rebecca thought of Mrs. Hollis's iron-gray hair and her limp and the way she had taught the small even stitches by which the sovereigns had ridden into Ashcombe in the hem of a cloak, and she thought of Miss Ida keeping the deed under her bed for 11 years in a house the village had been told to forget. She had been sent for her lack of family, for her cheapness, for her silence. She had been chosen because she had nothing to lose and no one to tell. She had used all 3. Outside, the light was going early over the wet fields, and the east chimney and the kitchen chimney were both smoking, and Mrs. Barrow was baking bread below, and somewhere on the London road a duke's letter was being answered by a solicitor in Silent Street, Ipswich. Rebecca folded the button back into its linen and laid it in the tin box on top of the papers and closed the lid. Miss Ida had shut her eyes. Rebecca sat on in the warm room with the box on her knee and understood, without needing to say it, that the arrangement Mr. Peter Redgrave had made in his London chambers had reversed itself entirely. The disposable servant had become the hand through which the estate was held, and the shuttered wing that was meant to hide an old woman had, in the end, hidden nothing that mattered except the paper by which the old woman kept her name. Rebecca Shaw was 23, and she had come to Ashcombe with £3 4 in the hem of her cloak, a mother-of-pearl button in a tin box, and a written character she had signed herself, and she had spent all of it on a post no one else would take in a shuttered country house at the end of a chalk lane. It was the best £3 4 she ever spent. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe and share it with someone who values quiet endurance over loud victories. And tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. And before you go, sit with this question a while. What have you been handed that others called worthless? A place, a person, a paper, a task that turned out, in the keeping of it, to be the thing that gave you back your name.